The Sega 32X, the most underrated video game console of all time. Released in 1994 in North America, it was the gap in between the 16-bit Genesis and the Sega Saturn. What I don't understand is why people hate the Sega 32X, and they always gloss over the games of the 32X and simply only view the 32X from a money-making perspective, which isn't an important factor in analyzing if a system is a failure or not. But money is not the only factor that determines whether a console is a good game console. Is it? To me, I think that most of the games for the 32X were pretty great, but just like every console, it had its misfits, its bad games, its good games, and its great games. And for some strange reason, the Sega CD seems to get more praise than the 32X. The 32X, in the eyes of most gamers, is viewed as a total failure, and possibly Sega's greatest failure as a game company. I'm here to hopefully convince you that all of that is a bunch of cow shit. So first of all, let's talk about it. When the 32X was launched in 1994, initial sales were very strong, actually, in the United States, selling a lot of units and a lot of games. And Sega poured a $10 million marketing campaign for the 32X. And these sales dropped drastically in time during mid-1995 because Sega kept announcing that the Sega Saturn was getting released in late 1995. It wasn't that the 32X was a failure, it was because Sega announced the Saturn too early and launched the Saturn too early, and that's what hurt the sales of the 32X. But the console itself of the 32X is a great console, and due to these unfair conditions, that doesn't mean that the console is a failure. This was a mistake on Sega's part. Most people view the 32X as the cause for the failure of Sega as a company. It was Sega's failure as a game company was launching the Sega Saturn too early. That was why Sega failed as a hardware manufacturer. Forget the Dreamcast stuff down the line, that's a whole other story. But during this most important time period where they're hemorrhaging money for the first time, the first failure of Sega, was launching the Sega Saturn way too damn early. The launch lineup for the Sega Saturn was pretty mediocre and kind of embarrassing for a hyped up game console. And even in 1995 alone, there weren't a big amount of Sega Saturn titles out there to play for gamers, which is odd because 1996 feels like the actual first year of the Saturn, and it isn't. It's supposed to be 1995. As soon as Sega fans and video gamers alike in the 90s heard about the news of the Sega Saturn, the sales for the 32X plummeted, and the console was done. What they should have done was launch the Sega Saturn in late 1996, around the same exact time period that the Nintendo 64 was launched, so that you could have had on the same day as the Nintendo 64 in late 1996. So therefore, the 32X would have lasted for 1994, 1995, and the first half of 1996. And if you did that, the 32X would have been around for 2.5 years, and there would have been way more games, the console would have sold more, and it would have been more successful, and it wouldn't have been viewed as a giant fail. So really, the demise of the 32X was just because of Sega's announcement of the Sega Saturn, and launching the Sega Saturn too early. That doesn't mean that the 32X was a failure. It's just because people didn't want to keep buying it and buy games for it because Sega was dropping support for the console. It's really not its own console though. It's technically an add-on to the Sega Genesis because it utilizes the power of the Genesis and the 32X itself, basically combining two pieces of hardware to create a new 32X experience.